So just to introduce myself, Steph did a great job. But like she said, my name is Jenn Feldman. I go by she, her. I have long brown hair. I'm cisgendered and white. I'm wearing a white long sleeve t-shirt. And I am neurodivergent myself. So it's nice to meet all of you.
I'm pretty close to the same, except my clothes are much brighter colored. And the thing I like to tell folks is if you see something blinking in my hair, you're not crazy. That is my mic. So, and I'm on the deck of, and if you don't know, I'm not going to tell you. So.
Cool. So
I do want to also say that our subtitle for this talk really could be how not to be a tool in the workplace.
That's very true. Very true. How not to be a tool. One of the things that Teresa and I talked about when we were planning on, participating in this event is our preference would be to chat with each other and to walk you through how we work together and how we do our best to try to prepare businesses, but in a really sociable way, because if they're not buying into this process in a way that is exciting, then we're not really going to gain the traction. And as what Specialisterne has been finding is that neurodiversity is having a moment, but not everybody exactly knows how to do this. And so a lot of the work that Teresa and I are doing is really to prepare businesses to be able to create environments where a neurodivergent person doesn't have to be the one to change. The environment has to be the thing that changes. And that's really what both of our focuses are. A little bit of a different capacity, but certainly, that's the way that we want to move forward.
Yeah. And what we're going to show here, I think both of us do this a lot. We call it the roadshow when we go into organizations. So I know Jen goes into big companies, and I just go into different. I also go into big companies, but mostly I go into different teams around the company I work for, and we just start with the basics. What is the difference between neurodiversity and neurotypical and neurodivergence? And I think you all have gotten that already today, but in case you've been following along and pretending you know what the heck we're talking about, neurodiversity is the diversity in all of our neurons. We all have different brains. Some are linear thinkers, some are creative thinkers, some are introverts, some are extroverts. Our brains are all different. That gets parsed out sometimes into neurodivergence when we're a little more different than everybody else's differences, and neurotypical, which is what we fit into the middle of that bell curve. Neurodivergence covers a lot of different things. Dyslexia, dyscalculia, which nobody can say, but we all heard about. I think if we put the emphasis on a different part, if we say dyscalculia, I don't know. Dyspraxia, Tourette's, there's lots of things that fit under that umbrella. We tend to focus on autism. That is how we have scoped, and which is what a lot of what the scoping has been today. But I want to caveat before we get rolling, Jen, that most of what we say here today is broad generalizations, and we know that. We know that. These are really broad generalizations for the sake of communication. The things we're going to say are pretty statistically true, but they don't fit everybody. And, high tech is not the only area people can work. We know that. I work for a high tech company. That's where I get money from. So, and those tend to be the big money companies. So that's where a lot of the roles specifically targeting neurodivergence are. So all that caveat out of the way. We did want this to be a conversation, so we didn't assign. Do you want to hit the definitions, or do you want to hit the recap of why you need to be well-rounded?
Sure, I can certainly talk about autism, and then we can talk together about being well-rounded. I think, autism as a diagnosis is a developmental diagnosis that's found in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. We're in our 5th edition. And so there might be some of you that identify as somebody with Asperger's syndrome. And as our organization kind of believes, it's really important that just like we would honor identity in gender, we want to honor identity in whatever your diagnosis is. So if you got diagnosed at 2 as Asperger's syndrome, and now that diagnosis doesn't exist anymore, we don't want to remove a part of your identity. And so what we think about with autism is that it is a developmental disability that kind of ranges a bunch of different categories. And this image does a fantastic job of demonstrating that we're looking at communication, we're looking at social interaction, but we're also looking at things like information processing and sensory filters, because a lot of what we think about when we're at work is that there are really high expectations for staying organized, but also socializing with your peers and with your managers and with your team members, and also communicating effectively for the other person's communication style, not necessarily for your own. And we also have to consider the environment and how that impacts our body. All of those things can be different for somebody with autism. And so identifying what those differences are, to Pete's point, and really understanding what it is that you need and how your lived experience impacts your day-to-day work is what we think about in the context of autism. But I think that what Teresa and I have been preparing for today is to really think about removing autism from that conversation altogether, and kind of normalizing the fact that we can ask each other how we work best in all of these different categories and probably have a much more effective workplace. And so, yes, we're talking about it in the context of autism because, like Teresa mentioned, there's a social dominant that we all have to work through. There's a system in place that was designed for people not like us. And so chipping away at that design structure is taking some time. And we're talking about it in the context of autism because it means something to people, and there's a representation. So we have to think about how autism presents itself, how every single person is different, all of their support needs are different. You'll notice here that we don't say anything about high functioning or low functioning, and that's because it doesn't really tell us anything. It doesn't indicate what's needed in one environment versus another. I can be totally fine in my apartment where I can control my sensory input and my environment and when I take a break and how I communicate either via writing or verbal. I can't necessarily do that in a workplace. And so a lot of what we're talking about is how we can redesign environment. I also just want to mention, Teresa, just because you and I were chatting about it, with my ADHD, this Slack channel blowing up is really difficult for me to manage. So I just want to kind of say that out loud. I'm keeping an eye on it on that second screen, but it's not it's not going super well for me. So I'm just trying to manage both things.
I covered it. Telling me just to ignore it doesn't work. That's part of my sensory gating issues.
No,
right?
We can't ignore it.
I just covered it with something, so I can't get to it right now. But I do want to talk about this picture. I want to describe to you why this color wheel has these spiky charts on it. What I've done here is overlaid two different things because they together really talk about the point we're making here. So my friend Sean and I each took the ASPE quiz. And as you can tell, our results were quite different. Mine is blue, his is black. And it doesn't fit on this wheel. The wheel it came on was not as pretty as this wheel. So I overlaid it on this. So this is not an exact representation. This is just a broad, this isn't exact, this is a representation is what I meant to say. So of showing that, you want a well-rounded team, but if you want the whole team to be well-rounded, you need to take people's super strengths, unless you dumb them all down to the center, and then you're not getting strengths at anything, so that we're all the same. So a star is 5 points. It's not well-rounded, as they say in some of the personality tests that you do. So it becomes really important to find those people who are great at all the things you need and be really vocal. I have a couple of team members who are very meticulous. Very much about the details, very much about, day, date, and time, and is this done, and is this done, is this done, and I suck at that. I'm really good at sprinkling glitter all over everything and getting lots and lots of buy-in. So we're sitting in a meeting, and I'm sprinkling glitter, and everybody's like, yes, we want to do this. This is wonderful. And she stops us in the middle of our flow, and she says, how many students are you going to take, and when would you like them to start? Which is perfect, because I would have left that meeting feeling great with absolutely nothing to show for it. So I got them on board. She gets them nailed down. It is the perfect marriage. And she does a lot of other things like that for me. But that's where you can let people shine at what they're good at, as we've heard in all of these panels so far, and build a really well-rounded team that way. So we're still on the first slide, and we've taken forever. Keep going. Oh, I love this slide, not just because I made it, but because it is a kicker. When we're talking to folks about how to deal with neurodivergence in your team, and some people say, how do I know? And the answer is, it doesn't matter. This applies to everybody on your team, as Jen was saying. The biggest thing is to check your assumptions. This is totally anecdotal. I have no research on this. I've just gathered this from lots of stories. A lot of my friends who are on the spectrum, they don't make assumptions. They're not going to walk in a room, see everybody in khakis and a blue button down and assume that's the dress code. They're not going to go to 3 meetings and assume that, oh, we always show up 5 minutes early for meetings. I had a team whose meetings were often done before the set time. They're not going to assume that. You need to know how to articulate that. So when you catch yourself thinking, everybody knows that. That is common sense. That's your flag. Stop. What is it that everybody knows? Exactly. How would you word that in a sentence? Why would everybody know it? If it came out in the corporate email this morning, they should know it. If it's something everybody should just know, stop. One of my favorite examples actually came out of a Specialisterne story, but someone was hired in, they walked in the first day, they were meeting everybody, all the leadership and their coworkers, and they came across a coworker and said, "You are morbidly obese. Do you know that that's really bad for your health?" Okay, so why would you not do that, right? So everybody on the team's like, "Oh, he's so rude," or could have been, but why? Why is that rude? And then you address it as that, not as, "Oh, he's such a jerk," right? So that's my rant on assumptions and stopping yourself knowing what your team's assumptions are and being able to articulate that. We always come 5 minutes early. Nobody turns on their camera for meetings. We don't eat during meetings. Work is always turned in late. That's just the way things go. Things like that, know that so that you can articulate it.
I also think that it's really important for us to think about like how many things are unspoken. I think that like, especially in a virtual change, when we think about like, when you have a meeting until 11:30 and then you have another meeting at 11:30, when is the expectation for you to grab a glass of water and go to the restroom? And so I think that we've all kind of assumed this understanding that meetings start at the 3rd minute. At Specialisterne, we've been calling it Specialisterne time because there's no time in between meetings. But then if somebody shows up at 11 and nobody is there for an 11 o'clock meeting, and then everybody shows up at 11:03 and says, "Well, why are you here so early?" Well, nobody told me that the 3rd minute is when everybody starts. So when are you going to articulate to me that that's the rule now? I think that there's also like, if you think about acronyms or sarcasm or like any of these things, like we have to be very aware of our impact on other people. And I think that intention is different than impact. So our intention was relieve yourself, take a break, and then come and be your best self at your meeting. That intention is really good. The impact of a neurodivergent person who shows up on time at 11 o'clock is, holy crap, did the meeting get canceled? What do I do? It's 11:02. Should I log off? I'm not sure. And it creates this level of anxiety that's so unnecessary. If we were really explicit about what is end of day, is it 5 o'clock Eastern? Is it 5 o'clock Pacific? Is it 7 o'clock? Some people stop at midnight. That's technically the end of the workday, 24 hours. So these are all things that like, they seem like, incidental examples, but when you add all of that up, it could really break a neurodivergent person's opportunity to be really successful in their workplace because they're trying to translate all of these behaviors instead of focusing on their work.
I just had this conversation with my dad 2 weeks ago. Common sense is not common.
It's not common.
Unless you've specifically told everybody.
Unless you're neurotypical.
Common, yeah, just because you know it doesn't mean everybody, that's a whole other discussion. My father.
We could go into that. Anyway. So a lot of what we think about when we think about like accommodations that work for everybody, and we try to avoid idioms. And I make a really funny joke in a lot of these education sessions that I do of like the concept of working like a dog. Like I'm looking over at my mini poodle, all 4 of her legs are up right now, fully on her back. She doesn't look like she's working so hard. So if Teresa's saying to me, "Oh, I'm working like a dog," I'm looking over and I'm like, she must not be working so hard. I'll give her something else to do. These are things that we can totally avoid in a workplace, like right now.
And you say totally avoid like that's easy.
That's because
that is like part
A
of
lot
my
of things
soul
that
that I have had to work so hard at that. And that side joke and that little bit of sarcasm and those things, I catch myself all the time. It's yeah, we're not saying simple doesn't mean easy. So
simple
it is
doesn't
simple.
mean easy. Very true.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, the concept of how many idioms we say, I think that like once you start bringing in awareness to it, like I've been in education sessions and I literally will say out loud in front of 400 people, like, bad Jen, that is an idiom. You should be teaching people to not
so
do
bad.
that.
I'm
And
so
yet you're
bad.
doing that, right? And so a lot of like what we're thinking about in terms of how, and the reason I teed this up is because I'm about to use an idiom. I think that as long as you explain what the idiom means, it's okay, but I am about to use an idiom. So like, warning. But you know, high tides raise all ships. And what I mean by that is when you put in accommodations that are going to benefit the entire organization, you then start to normalize the concept of accommodations, and they're really no longer accommodations, they're just supports. And then we're talking about, and Steph, you know, reviewed it right before we began our talk, like my goal is to think about hiring, not neurodiversity hiring, not specialized programming. How are we going to design inclusive workplaces for everybody? I think everybody would benefit from written instruction for a project that's going to take 6 months, or processing time. Why don't we give each other processing time? These are things that everybody can benefit from. You know, there's a discussion in Canada around whether or not we should be having 4-day work weeks to manage all of the computer time. Is that something that's going to support everybody? Is that going to be allowing a family to go to the kiddo's baseball game? Is that going to allow for you to actually go to the grocery store instead of ordering Instacart? Like, these are all things that we take advantage of if we're provided it. And so I think that as we're working through these things, what kinds of accommodations are going to work for everyone? Are we asking if we want video on or off? Or are we just assuming that everybody should be turning their video off because that one person that logged on first kept their camera on? These are all things that we need to talk about with each other. I just noticed that avoid idioms for social is actually on there. So I think that's good that I covered it, because I don't think I realized that. So this is where we really think about, like, you know, at Specialisterne, we have something called a job analysis. And that's something where we take the job postings that currently exist, and we, like this slide says, we really try to differentiate the nice to have skills and the day one requirements. If I show up on day one of my job, what is it that I'm going to be expected to do? What can I learn? I think oftentimes managers, you know, they include every single skill that they would like to see in the hopes that somebody's going to read that and say, well, I have 75% of the requirements, so sure, I'll shoot my shot. I'll try. You know, what's the worst that happens? I don't get the job. For somebody that's very literal, we're thinking about, well, I don't qualify.
That's
So,
law.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah. So, you know, when we're thinking, like, I remember being in when we used to do interviews, we actually have removed interviews from our entire process, because all an interview predicts is how good you are at an interview. It doesn't actually predict how good you are at a job. And so a lot of what we've been thinking about is that, you know, I was in this interview, and this this young man, you know, he was asked a very, you know, black or white question: do you know Excel? And he responds to the recruiter, no. And I'm sitting there being like, yes, you do. Yes, you do. Like, tell them that you know Excel. Like, this is, why are you saying that you don't know Excel? Well, I don't know that one macro that's been collecting dust for the past 3 years that the creator of Excel doesn't even know about. So I don't know Excel. Now, if we were to ask the question in a different way, in a recruitment guide, in a job description, and say, you need to know pivot tables, you need to know VLOOKUPs, and you need to know these 3 macros, somebody is going to know what is expected of them on day one. It's a lot clearer, right? So when we think about the information that's included, we can adjust the information. Teresa, I think that when you talk about like things to not do, I'd really like you to come, like, if it's possible, because I think like the use of complex fonts and colors is new to me too. So, that's really interesting to see.
Well, that hits dyslexia, right? And
Yeah,
the difficulty in reading and the just the disruption to your thought process. Reusing old job descriptions is everybody does it.
Yeah.
Don't do it. Or publish without having it checked for clarity. I think really there's a deeper thing here that you need to sort of keep in your head when you're writing a job description. There are whole populations of people who have been told no for various reasons, have been told they don't qualify throughout their whole lives for various reasons, either implicitly or explicitly. And those groups of people go to your job description looking for a reason to exclude themselves instead of looking for the 3 things that will include them. And the less you have in there that they can use to exclude themselves, the more likely they are to apply for your roles. It's going to get you a more diverse pool to choose from. It's going to get you more targeted talent for your role. Take out the stuff people can use to disqualify themselves. Good communication skills, like we were talking about earlier. What does that mean? Does that mean notes in your code? Does that mean I have to be able to give these presentations? I'm good at one and not the other. I'm going to let you guys decide which is which. So specificity is important, but also just take out as much as you can so that people don't disqualify themselves.
Yeah, cast a wide net. You can always down select once applicants are in your system. You can't do that if the applicant isn't in your system. And there's also, a unique opportunity that we've been finding is that when we do cast a wide net and we collect all of these recruits that are capable and motivated and work ready, businesses will come to us and say, well, they don't technically qualify for this role, but we have this role. If we didn't cast that wide of a net, we wouldn't have that opportunity to actually take a look at what a person's competencies are and match them to competencies. And this is what all of these professionals want, is for a competent person, right? So like when you think about, oh, well, we need 5 years of job experience. So tell me what competencies are developed in that 5 years. Because I've met a lot of people who worked for 5 years at a company and sat on their hands the whole time and didn't learn anything. So what does 5 years actually mean? Is it the competencies of enlisting in the military, where you learn leadership and all of these things? These are all inclusion opportunities for us to consider competency as opposed to qualification.
And as you go to the next slide, I just want to say, check your AI. If you're using a tool, a lot of times they will automatically exclude folks. All right, we're going to just talk really quick about the styles that our companies are using and or propose to other companies, just so that you can see that there are lots of ways to be inclusive. I just want to say that we're moving towards less programmatic and more systematic, but because of where we are right now, we need that program to point to say, see, we need to change all these things. See how great they're doing? That's because of this and that. So we have a small program at MITRE called the Portal Project, where we target students who are neurodivergent. We have both ADHD and autism, mostly autism. We target from schools that we know support them well. And sometimes you have to dig for that. We recruit from departments within the company that we know will support them well, or we think will support them well. Sometimes we learn that's not the case, which just want to say to the side. This is way more of a manager apprenticeship program than an internship program. And so God love these students that power through for 3 months. At the end of that 3 months, I know whether that manager is a place that I want to place people or not. Hopefully they've learned a ton too. So we train up the managers. We do this basic Autism 101 and Neurodiversity 101, the coworkers, the mentors. We do that separate from when people start, so that all the coworkers, so we don't say, this is what autism is. Oh, look, here's a new person. So that disclosure is up to that student once they get on the team, other than their directs who hired through our program, which means they know what's going on. We work one-on-one with the students. We do bi-weekly meetings with the managers and with the students. And then, and that actually is that often because both have asked for that. We actually were doing it once a month, and both the students and the managers separately asked for more meetings, oddly. And then we also asked the schools to check in really regularly to provide that job coaching, life coaching stuff that is so important. Next slide is our, oh, it's your recording. Oh, good, your turn.
Perfect. Yeah, so just to walk you through very briefly to understand like how we prepare businesses for building these neurodiversity hiring programs, it's really important to talk about how this is a side door opportunity. This is not the front door. Our organization is really focused on identifying how we can build out the front door and really support companies in mainstreaming some of these things. But we're not there yet. And that's something that's, of course, disappointing to us, but it is the reality of the environment that we're working in. And as a social worker, I've always learned about systems theory and how you work within a system in order to really manage some of the ways that you grow. And so we have a 5-phased approach to recruitment and onboarding. We start with all of that job analysis that Teresa and I were talking about earlier, and we really pull apart what is absolutely required and what is a nice to have skill. We're also supporting managers in understanding, like, how are you going to preview for a candidate what their environment is going to feel like, look like, who they're going to meet with, what the expectations will be, all of those kind of soft, unspoken skills that we talk about, and actually make them a little bit harder, right? So think about like, okay, it's a soft skill to have to communicate effectively. Well, can you flesh out what communicate effectively is? Is it okay for somebody to communicate in written form? Like, are you cool with that? Or is it more of like a presentation? Now, we can find a neurodivergent person for every single job that's open on the market right now, in my opinion. It's about competencies. I love having these kinds of conversations, but to Teresa's point, I am shite at organizing my documentation. So what is that going to mean for me when I'm entering into a role? How is a manager going to support me? Because I'm really good at the presentation. I can do that part. What I can't do is send Jennifer the deck on time. That I can't do, right? So these are all things that like we talk about in role analysis. Just be honest with us. Tell us what your workplace is like. If it's a trade floor and everybody is running around and yelling at each other and there are computers flashing everywhere, that's okay. But let's be explicit about what that is. Not just, you can handle a dynamic environment. What the heck does that mean? Okay, cool. So after we deal with like all of the recruitment analysis piece, then we actually go out and recruit. And it's a very comprehensive application process to deal with what I brought up before, which is, do you know Excel? So we're not asking questions like that. We're more asking questions like, how much of Excel do you know? What is your, what do you feel is your competency? Are you a basic understanding, an intermediate understanding of the skill, an advanced understanding? And we define that for candidates. What is basic? Because basic to Teresa might mean something different than basic to me, right? So after we do all of that recruitment, we try to design a psychologically safe place where candidates can come and be assessed. And so a lot of it feels like interactive games. We play something called Stranded. It's like, you know, are you stuck on a desert island? And really what we're thinking about is not like, can you tell me what you would bring on a desert island? But are you able to problem solve with your peers? Are you able to interact and accept different opinions or different perspectives? So these are all ways that we're determining those like quote unquote soft skills, because we've done that work with the business. Throughout this whole time, we're also doing a lot of training for the business, because like I said earlier, we're not expecting an autistic person to show up and just like know how to do things. And we're also ensuring that the environment is safe for them to enter into. We talk a lot about disclosure in that environment. So it's really important to recognize that just because you're coming through a specialized program doesn't mean that everybody on your team should know that you've come through a specialized program. And the beauty of being virtual is that nobody needs to know until the day that you show up. So the two people that are going to keep you safe are your manager and your HR representative. Those are the only two people that need to know the things that you need. That's it. If you want to tell everybody, go for it. That's your prerogative. But if you want only certain people to know, we do our best to try to keep that kind of locked in. And then we also can't assume that like a manager knows how to support you either. And so we provide 12 weeks of employment support where we meet one-on-one with a candidate or a new hire, and one-on-one with a hiring manager. And then if there's a challenge that gets brought up, we can address it pretty quickly and identify what the support need is. But really our goal is to strengthen the relationship between the manager and the employee, because like Pete said earlier, like your best manager is yourself. That to us is really disappointing, because we can support managers in developing some of those skills to be a great manager, to add tools to their toolbox. And so a big part of that is actually training the manager, not necessarily training the autistic person. Now, I think that the MITRE program, although it's a little bit of a different population that you're serving, is a very similar program. Yeah.
It is. We learned everything from you guys. So, but we have like 6 minutes left. So I just want to say, this is our pilot that we do with federal agencies. So we're also teaching the federal government. We're trying to teach the federal government how to be better at neuro inclusion. Some agencies are pretty okay at it, and some are really, really, really bad at it. So our goal is to change that. So we've got a couple of pilots running now. We're talking with a couple of other agencies. There are some, there's a CBS This Morning piece talking about, if you Google SPY, CBS This Morning, SPY and Neurodiversity, you'll be able to see it. This is one of our interns. Next, let's see. We got some good stuff here.
Let's through it. I know.
All right. Clarity. We don't even need to talk about this one. Go to the next one, because that's most important. When I talk to folks on the spectrum, I hear two things that kill their career. Masking, because it is exhausting to pretend you're not autistic all day long. And clarity. I just needed clarity. I just asked for clarity. All I wanted was clarity, and they put me on a pip because they said I'm being belligerent. I just need clarity. And I think a lot of people don't understand what that means. So back to Jen's point about idioms and acronyms and using words literally, giving an exact due date, that works for ADHD as well. God, please don't tell me when you can, because it is not gonna happen. Even if you just make up a date, put a time on there too, that'd be great. Really, it's really important to people's success. Clearly prioritize. What do you need me to do first? I have 4 things due today, by the way, kind of freaking out right now. I know this comes first because I'm actually on camera. So tell me what I have to have right now and what I can do tomorrow if you can prioritize, and then put it in writing. Say it and put it in writing.
Also, I think that something that you and I talked about and speaks to this slide is this idea of like cluster questions or cluster tasks, where it's like, yeah, this, and this. And it's like, well, I only heard the first one. So if the first one is not the priority, then give me the first one as the priority, because that's the only one that I'm going to hear. Yeah. The way that I work best is by you just giving me one task at a time. Is that possible? Can you give me 2 tasks if that's not possible? Can you please try to limit what's in front of me? Because my ADHD is going to make this really hard to organize. And all that's going to happen is that you're going to be disappointed in me. So I'm communicating to you the things that I need so that I can optimize on the skill set that I know that I have.
And check in, non-judgmental check-ins. How's that going? Is it done? How's that going? Is it done? My team is amazing at this. Did you get that form filled out? How's that form going? Hey, let's set 15 minutes on your calendar and I will sit here and do something completely different while you fill out that form. It's such a blessing to me because stuff gets done. But it's non-judgmental. Like, they just know that's how I work, and I know that they work in other ways, and we're very open about it and assume that that's the best way we work. So clarity.
Go ahead, Teresa.
I just said clarity. That was it. Go ahead.
I think if you notice, like, we're not talking about disability necessarily. We're not talking about diagnosis in that conversation, right? We're saying this is the way that I work best. It doesn't have anything to do with a diagnosis at that point. And that, I think, brings us back to normalizing, asking each other those questions. I was monitoring the Slack while I was in my meeting before this, and unfortunately I had to miss part of the session. But one of the things that Teresa said in the Slack channel was, it goes both ways with managers and employees. And if we start asking each other, how do we work best? Then it eliminates this idea of, well, it's because you're autistic or it's because you have ADHD. No, it's because that's the way that my brain is wired. And quite frankly, I didn't have the diagnosis of ADHD 6 months ago, but I'm the same human from 6 months ago as now. So with my late diagnosis, now all of a sudden there's a reason for it, or can I just communicate these are the things that I need? One of the things that Teresa and I also talked about is that, like, when you're addressing any kind of issue, performance-based or behavior-based, like a diagnosis doesn't excuse for bad behavior in anybody. And bad behavior for any employee is not necessarily excusable. We have to define what bad is, right? We have to understand where somebody is coming from to understand what it is that their intention is. Is it malicious? Because in the case that Teresa described of, like, well, being overweight is really bad for your health, there's research to back that up.
Yeah.
It's not like that, like, it's not like that came out of nowhere. Now, is that something that you talk about over coffee while you're waiting for a meeting to start? Like, that might impact somebody negatively, and then we can be explicit about why that impacted somebody negatively. But that person's intentions weren't bad. I think that, like, if we can kind of parse out, like, what is intentional and what isn't intentional, that will really help in understanding, like, being having a diagnosis doesn't excuse certain behaviors, and being okay with saying, like, look, part of respect of a person is communicating effectively, being clear, being empathetic, but also not expecting less. So if you're expecting different from an autistic person in terms of behavior, then we're not actually doing the equitable thing that we are all committed to doing. And so a lot of what we're thinking about here is, like, how are we going to manage all of this, right? And respect is not expecting less. Respect is expecting the way that interactions happen in a workplace so that we can get really productive work done.
Now,
I think
that's not to say they couldn't be different or shouldn't be different.
Correct.
But we're not lowering anybody's bar as far as work goes, or, you know,
Correct.
how many people come away crying from your meetings.
And that is an accessibility thing for us. You know, it's more about, like, it's not that we're expecting less, it's that once we get into place, once we get into the role. So, you know, a lot of this is about respecting each other and what we bring, right? And I think that the biggest point that I want to make in all of these boxes, and we can go into the hallway if anybody wants me to expand on any of these boxes, I think that the biggest thing is meeting people where they are. My communication style doesn't have to be the same as Teresa's. And if I can deliver my communication the way that Teresa needs it delivered, that is respecting who she is and what she can bring and what her needs are. And it's not because it's my communication style. Because if I impose my communication style on Teresa, then we're not really going to effectively communicate if our styles are different.
What she said.